Islam, the way by Beye. It is March the 17th, 2019. As a Hebrew Muslim, your wife, this lifetime. My nationality is Moorish American. I run the Arrington-Bey. Is going to read about the 14th Amendment. Malik-Beye, and I run the Arrington-Bey. We don't know anyone. I like to state this, try to state this with every video now. Anyone personally here in Annapolis, Maryland, we try to respect everyone's boundaries. And I think it's through wisdom, it's good for us to state that, because as Moorish Americans who have affirmed to uphold the Constitution of 1787, the Abraham Lincoln's proclamations, the 13th Amendment with 20 sections, we realize masses of people, too many, have not been naturalized to do this. And since they have not been naturalized to uphold this divine law, that means they are navigating or operating on a foreign jurisdiction. And so that makes them vulnerable to be used as spiritual, mental terrorists and physical terrorists. And then also they have the science that causes masses to be telepathic. So as natural beings who are navigating under a natural law, we use wisdom, because we know we are among an imbalanced and unstable society. Okay. I'm going to start off reading about the 14th Amendment. I just got through reading the Beye about the 14th Amendment through Moorish literature. Prophet Noble Jew Ali, divine and natural, a divine warning by the prophet in Moorish literature. So now I'm going to read about the 14th Amendment by David Lawrence, U.S. News and World Report, September the 27th, and this is in 1957 that this was written. And it's called "There is no 14th Amendment." A mistaken belief that there is a valid article in the Constitution known as the 14th Amendment is responsible for the Supreme Court decision of 1954 and the ensuing controversy over desegregation in the public schools of America. No such amendment was ever legally ratified by 3/4 of the states of the Union as required by the Constitution itself. The so-called 14th Amendment was dubiously proclaimed by the Secretary of State on July 20th, 1868. The President shared that doubt. There were 37 states in the Union at the time, so ratification by at least 28 was necessary to make the amendment an integral part of the Constitution. Actually, only 21 states legally ratified it, so it failed of ratification. The undisputed record, attested by official journals and the unanimous writings of historians, establishes these events as occurring in 1867 and 1868. Outside the South, 6 states: New Jersey, Ohio, Kentucky, California, Delaware, and Maryland failed to ratify the proposed amendment. In the South, 10 states: Texas, Arkansas, Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia, Alabama, Florida, Mississippi, and Louisiana, by formal action of their legislatures, rejected it under the normal process of civil law. A total of 16 legislatures out of 37 failed legally to ratify the 14th Amendment. Congress, which had deprived the southern states of their seats in the Senate, did not lawfully pass the resolution of submission in the first instance. The southern states, which had rejected the amendment, were coerced by a federal statute passed in 1867 that took away the right to vote or hold office from all citizens who had served in the Confederate Army. Military governors were appointed and instructed to prepare the roll of voters. All this military governors were appointed and instructed to prepare the roll of voters. All this happened in spite of the presidential proclamation of amnesty previously issued by the president. Okay? And I'm just reminding myself, this was written by David Lawrence, U.S. News, in 1957. New legislatures were thereupon chosen and forced to ratify under penalty of continued exile from the Union. In Louisiana, a general sent down from the North presided over the state legislature. Abraham Lincoln had declared many times that the Union was inseparable and indivisible. After his death, and when the war was over, the ratification by the southern states of the 13th Amendment abolishing slavery had been accepted as legal, but Congress in the 1867 law imposed the specific conditions under which the southern states would be entitled to representation in Congress in passing the 1867 law that declared the southern states could not have their seats in either the Senate or House in the next session unless they ratified the 14th Amendment, took an unprecedented step. No such right to compel a state by an act of Congress to ratify a constitutional amendment is to be found anywhere in the Constitution. Nor has this procedure ever been sanctioned by the Supreme Court of the United States. President Andrew Johnson publicly denounced this law as unconstitutional, but it was passed over his veto. Secretary of State Seward was on the spot in July 1868 when the various ratifications of a spurious nature were placed before him. The legislatures of Ohio and New Jersey had notified him that they rescinded their early action of ratification. He said in his official proclamation that he was not authorized as Secretary of State to determine and decide doubtfully questions as to the authenticity of the organization of state legislatures, or as to the power of any state legislature to recall a previous act or resolution of ratification. He added that the amendment was valid if the resolutions of the legislatures of Ohio and New Jersey ratifying the aforesaid amendment are to be deemed as remaining of full force and effect, notwithstanding the subsequent resolutions of the legislatures of these states. This was a very big if. It will be noted that the real issue, therefore, is not only whether the forced ratification by the 10 southern states was lawful, but rather the withdrawal by the legislatures of Ohio and New Jersey, two northern states, was legal. The right of a state, by action of its legislature, to change its mind at any time before the final proclamation of ratification is issued by the Secretary of State, has been confirmed in connection with other constitutional amendments. The Oregon legislature in October 1868, 3 months after the Secretary's proclamation was issued, passed a rescinding resolution which argued that the 14th Amendment had not been ratified by 3/4 of the states, and that the ratifications in the southern states were usurpations, unconstitutional, revolutionary, and void, and that until such ratification is completed, any state has a right to withdraw its assent to any proposed amendment. What do the historians say about all this? The Encyclopedia Americana states, Reconstruction added humiliation to suffering. 8 years of crime, fraud, and corruption followed, and it was state legislatures composed of Negroes, carpetbaggers, and scallywags who obeyed the orders of the generals and ratified the amendment. W.E. Woodward, in his famous work, A New American History, published in 1936, says, to get a clear idea of the succession of events, let us review President Andrew Johnson's actions in respect to the ex-Confederate states. In May 1865, he issued a proclamation of amnesty to former rebels. Then he established provisional governments in all the southern states. They were instructed to call constitutional conventions. They did. New state governments were elected. White men only had the suffrage. The 15th Amendment establishing equal voting rights had not yet been passed. Senators and representatives were chosen, but when they appeared at the opening of Congress, they were refused admission. The state governments, however, continued to function during 1866. Now we are in 1867. In the early days of that year, Thaddeus Stephen brought in, as chairman of the House Reconstruction Committee, a bill that proposed to sweep all the southern state governments into the wastebasket. The South was to be put under military rule. The South was to be put under military rule. The bill passed. It was vetoed by Johnson and passed again over his veto. In the Senate, it was amended in such fashion that any state could escape from military rule and be restored to its full rights by ratifying the 14th Amendment and admitting blacks as well as white men to the polls. In challenging its constitutionality, President Andrew Johnson said in his veto message, I submit to Congress whether this measure is not in its whole character, scope, and object without precedent and without authority. Impalpable conflict with the plainest provisions of the Constitution, and utterly destructive of those great principles of liberty and humanity for which our ancestors on both sides of the Atlantic have shed so much blood and expended so much treasure. Many historians have applauded Johnson's words. Samuel Eliot Morrison and Henry Steele Commander, known today as liberals, wrote in their book, The Growth of the American Republic. Johnson returned the bill with a scorching message arguing the unconstitutionality of the whole thing, and most impartial students have agreed with his reasoning. James Truslow Adam, another noted historian, writes in his History of the United States, the Supreme Court had decided 3 months earlier in the Milligan case. The military courts were unconstitutional except under such war conditions as might make the operation of civil courts impossible. But the president pointed out in vain that practically the whole of the new legislation was unconstitutional. There was even talk in Congress of impeaching the Supreme Court for its decisions. The legislature had run amok and was threatening both the executive and the judiciary. Actually, President Johnson was impeached, but the move fell by 1 vote in the Senate. The Supreme Court, in case after case, refused to pass on the illegal activities involved in ratification. It said simply that they were acts of the political departments of the government. This, of course, was a convenient device of avoidance. The court has adhered to that position ever since Reconstruction days. Andrew C. McLaglen, whose Constitutional History of the United States is a standard work, writes, "Can a state which is not a state and not recognized as such by Congress perform the supreme duty of ratifying an amendment to the fundamental law? Or does a state, by congressional thinking, cease to be a state for some purpose but not for others?" This is the tragic history of the so-called 14th Amendment, a record that is a disgrace to free government and a government of law. Is it the use of military force? Is it the use of military force to override local government, what we deplored in Hungary. I hope I said that right. It is never too late to correct injustice. The people of America should have an opportunity to pass on an amendment to the Constitution that sets forth the right of the federal government to control education and regulate attendance at public schools, either with federal power alone or concurrently with the states. That's the honest way, the just way to deal with the problem of segregation or integration in the schools. Okay, that's the honest way, the just way to deal with the problem of segregation or integration in the schools. Until such an amendment is adopted, the 14th Amendment should be considered as null and void. There is only one supreme tribunal. It is the people themselves. Their sovereign will be expressed through the procedures set forth in the Constitution itself, Islam. And so this was from the U.S. News and World Report, September 27, 1957, and it was written by David Lawrence, Islam. All right, it's March 17th, 2019. I'm Rhonda Arrington-Bey, Beye, Islam.